Everybody survive the holiday?
I think Bubs is here.
I like your background.
Thanks. There's a reason for that. Well, it looks like 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and jump in. Hopefully y'all will help me out a little bit this week. We got some stuff that might work better if we discuss it a little bit, but no pressure. So we're looking this week at chapter 3, and it's on collaboration. I'll talk a little bit historically speaking. There we go. So when we think about collaboration in schools, historically speaking, in the United States, schools did not have much collaboration. They had a boss. They had someone who kind of ruled with an iron fist. Up until 1642, it was clergymen who oversaw the community education. But in 1642, in Massachusetts, there was a law enacted that gave responsibility of the schools over to the elders of the community. Of course, it was the elder men, and only the boys were receiving education at that time. A very famous act or law that came out of that time period was a few years later, 5 years after that, and it was called the Old Deluder Satan Act. This is an interesting law if you want to look it up and laugh some point. Basically, they said because the old deluder Satan is trying to fool our children, we need to have schools in place. And so they call this the Old Deluder Satan Act. The schools were very much about inculcating the values of the Christians there into the community and teaching the boys how to be good Christian young men. And as communities grew, then of course you grew out of that one-room schoolhouse idea, but it was no big deal for the most part. Teachers just shut the door and taught, and this went on for a very long time. I might argue that it was this way up until the 1950s. Then some legislative factors came in. The civil rights movement. With this civil rights movement came school accountability. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law by LBJ, then this whole idea of being able to discriminate in any way, especially in schools, was outlawed. Then as part of LBJ's war on poverty, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 was signed. And this is when federal government got involved in local schools. You know, there's that part of the Constitution that says that these are the things that the federal government will take care of and all other rights are reserved to the states. Well, education is not one of those rights that the federal government really has any business being in the state's business about, but because of these laws and the civil rights legislation, they said, hey, states, y'all aren't taking care of it. You're not making sure that all of the civil rights of everybody is protected. So we're going to be involved now in the schools. In fact, the reason I have this building up here behind me, that's the one-room schoolhouse that LBJ attended. And this is where he signed this Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965. If you ever go down to Johnson City, you can tour the LBJ Ranch and this building is there. They have the inside of it set up like an old one-room schoolhouse, and you can walk up and look in the windows and that sort of thing. But it has a historical significance because this is where the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was first signed. That's the law that eventually became No Child Left Behind that we've all heard about, and then the All Students Succeed Act that followed that. Interestingly, none of those that we've talked about this far actually dealt with special education until we get to 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. Gerald Ford signed that into law, and it was interesting when he did, he said this: "I'm doing this because this is the right thing to do, but we cannot afford it." And ever since then, what the law was supposed to do was supposed to have the federal government paying for the special education needs above and beyond what it costs to educate a, quote, normal kid. But they've never even come close. If you check your local school board, they'll tell you probably 7 to 11% of their budget is federal money, which is not near enough to take care of all of the special ed needs, much less all the other unfunded mandates that have come into play. So moving on, other factors that have worked us toward this idea of collaboration for teachers is medical and technological advances. The medicine and technology has advanced so far that many of the kids that are in our schools now, many of the kids who qualify for special education, especially those who are more severely and profoundly disabled, just a few decades ago would not be alive. They would have died either during the birthing process or at some point between then and the age that they became school age. The advances in medicine have just been phenomenal, which is great, but presents a lot of problems when these kiddos who are medical miracles now come to our schools, and we need to educate them somehow. Another part of it is community expectations. You know, one of the big issues we've had during this whole COVID mess is when they close schools, well, who's going to take care of my kids? Schools are the de facto babysitter for so many people now. I know when I was a school principal at an elementary school that had a high socioeconomic or low socioeconomic, well, the way they work it is how many kids qualify for free and reduced lunch. We had a high number of our kids that qualified for free and reduced lunch. Therefore, we were considered a low socioeconomic school. Anytime that school would let out early for some reason and it wasn't scheduled or anything like that, parents wanted to know who's going to take care of their kids. Other factors that you might not think about that played into it were Sputnik. You know, the Russians put this Sputnik rocket into space with a man on it. And this led to the space race that led to going to the moon. And this is all part of the Cold War. All of this made us realize we need to really up our education. If we're going to compete with a world that's now putting people into outer space, we've got to up our education, especially science and math. You may have heard about House Bill 72, a guy named Ross Perot, who was a Texan, a very wealthy Texan. He actually ran for president a time or two. And he got a group together to talk about schools, and this was in Texas. This wasn't anywhere else. This was in Texas. And they wanted to really up the rigor of schools in Texas, make them more difficult, make sure that all kids were ready to go to college. Well, one of the ways that they did that was by taking out things like wood shop and metal shop and these, mechanics, all these auto mechanics and these other courses that some of the boys and a few of the girls had traditionally gone to that really kept them in school. You know, it was the one thing that was interesting to them. They weren't really good at the academics part, but they liked wood shop, or they liked metal shop. They liked working with their hands on getting, fixing small engines, all these kinds of things. Well, those sorts of programs were eliminated in favor of higher academics and more computer type classes. with the idea that all kids in Texas would go to college and be successful. And, you know, looking at data that says if you go to college, you're going to make more money than people that don't go to college and all that sort of thing. I don't know, probably some good and some bad that came out of that. Probably a lot more dropouts. And of course, that's one of the things that they're really focusing on the last decade or so is the whole dropout rate. Another huge thing that has led to collaboration is the high stakes testing. You know, we're talking about what was TAX and now is STAR and has had different names through the years, but it's the testing whereby schools are rated and those sorts of things. We've realized there's a huge need for, if we're going to get some of these kids past this test, one teacher is not going to be able to do it. And we have what I'm calling collateral damage from legislation and litigation, things that were kind of unintended consequences when the law says that somebody can go to school if they have a disability, and then somebody says, well, wait a minute, I just got kicked out of school, but I have a disability. We'll go on back to school even though you have a disability. I mean, because you have a disability, even though you've hurt someone, you get to stay in school. My granddad, when I was teaching, he never understood. He's like, why don't you send those kids to reform school anymore? I'm like, Papa, they don't have reform school anymore. Those things are gone. So collateral damage, all of these things have made it to where it's more difficult to be a teacher. You can't be all things to all people as if you're just one person. So we've begun to realize that teachers need help. They need a lot of assistance. So with that background, that kind of brings us up to the chapter. Let's talk about John. You remember John? This is his picture from page, what is this, 56 of the book. Can anybody tell me anything about John? Did y'all read that? Y'all have gone totally silent on me. All right, let's just look at him. Does this kid look like a special ed kid? Loaded question. Nobody gonna help me? All right, let's look at some of the things that it says about him. When we look at this introducing John part, it says that he's a second grader, that he's operating at the beginning first grade level, and that he's not real fluent in reading and math. Also says that he fits in well with his peers and that he has no behavior issues, but he has a 65 IQ. All right, remember we talked last week about the intelligence scales, and a 65 IQ falls here. So he's at about the 2.5, he's in that 2% that falls in that between 2 and 3 standard deviations below the norm. So he's operating in what used to be called the mental retardation range. It's now the intellectual disability range. And we find out that we're a second grade teacher who has gotten John placed in her class. Mrs. Waring is the name, but Mr. Doss, the special ed teacher, collaborates with Ms. Waring and sounds like is in the class all the time. All of this took place with the help of a school psychologist who was instrumental in attending all the meetings and those sorts of things and getting taking care of little John here. So what about John? When we look at his picture, we see he's really a cute kid. very bright looking kid. Me, being a special educator, being at this a long time, I'm just going to say it. Most special ed kids are not this cute. Most kids with an intellectual disability, you can look at them and you can say, something's just a little not quite right here. There's something a little dull going on there. They're not quite as bright-eyed. Things are different. And I'm not saying that you take a look at kids and diagnose them that way, but you'll find that you can kind of begin to spot kids, especially kids with intellectual disabilities. And this whole thing about that he doesn't have any behavior issues. Well, it says that he's a second grader and he operates at the beginning of first grade level. And he doesn't have any issues and gets along with all his peers. You're going to tell me there's not a second grade boy that makes fun of him? You're going to tell me that nobody has picked on him? He gets along well with everybody and he doesn't get frustrated with his education? I mean, the book's doing a great job of laying out an ideal scenario for collaboration, but I'm just not sure it's very real. I don't want to run anybody off from the field, but I want you to go in with your eyes open. I want you to realistically understand what's going on. I would love to have this kid in my class. I mean, he's a good-looking kid. I think he looks like a lot of fun. I bet he plays baseball. You know, it just looks like the ideal little kid. It talks a lot about the parents and the collaboration with the parents. Well, as a teacher, sometimes you think, man, what is wrong with this kid? And then you meet the parents and you're like, oh, well, that explains it. You know, I'm not trying to be mean or ugly, but just, you know, you got that whole apple tree thing. So is, you know, how much help can their parents really be if they too have disabilities? And I'm not saying they do. I mean, it doesn't tell us that they do or they don't. But what if they do? You know, how much help can we expect to get from parents who themselves have intellectual disabilities? So we look at this and we think, you know, this is great, but is it real? You know, when we look at collaboration, they've got a great collaboration going on here with Mr. Doss and Miss Waring, but does Mr. Doss spend his whole day helping John here fit into Miss Waring's class? What could possibly go wrong? Well, there's a ton of things that could go wrong here. You know, at some point, somebody's going to make fun of him. At some point, the curriculum's going to go so much further if everybody else is, quote, normal IQ and he's down there with his 65, then he's going to begin to get further and further behind. So let's talk about how it really works. When we look at key concepts of collaboration, the book talks about volunteering, and certainly, and parents can be so much help in volunteering. If they come in there and will make copies and do things for the teachers to help teachers, just you're going so many ways, and if they will help by doing those sorts of things, of course, then if you're going to have somebody volunteering to make your copies, you know, you got to get all that stuff ready ahead of time and all those sorts of things. So there's some responsibility on you there too. In collaboration, we also look at sharing resources. And most of us are pretty good at that. Hey, I found this really cool article on such and such. You want to read it? Sure, I want to read it. Or I found this great website. Or, hey, have you looked at teachers, pay teachers? Have you looked at the Autism Helper? Have you looked at all these different websites that are out there now that teachers can access? So we're pretty good at sharing resources. Sharing responsibility? I'm not sure about that. I can just hear the conversation between Mr. Doss and Miss Waring. Now, are you responsible for his grades or am I responsible for his grades? I mean, I don't really want him on my list if he's going to be failing since you're the one teaching him, and those sorts of things going on. Sharing decision making. If this teacher is pretty strong-willed, said, you know, this is my first grade class. I've been teaching first grade for 17 years now, and this is the way I do things. And Mr. Doss says, yeah, that may be, but I don't think that's going to work for John. We need to do it different. Well, it's my class. I make the decision. You know, you can see those sorts of problems happening. And achieving common goals, where Miss Waring is looking at the whole class and what's best for them. It's going to be difficult for Mr. Doss, the special educator, who is assigned to John, to not be looking out for John's interest over the interest of the rest of the students. When we further look at key concepts of collaboration, community building. You know, we all talk about we want our parents involved, we want the community involved. Well, that's great, but what are we going to do that? Most teachers are very busy people. You do your time at school, then you have a family that you go home and take care of. When are parents available? Well, usually they're not available during the school day because they're working themselves. So they need to meet after school or before school. And well, by the time it gets to after school, you're worn out. I mean, you've had a full day of kids. You also look at this whole idea of parity. You know, if we have two teachers working together, are they equal or is one in charge? How's this going to work out? If you have a teacher and an aide or paraprofessional, it's pretty easy to see how that's going to work out. But what about two teachers? Differing levels of work. You know, Mrs. Waring may have that conversation with Mr. Dawson and say, you know, I know that you're doing a really good job with John, but that's great. But remember, I've got 21 other kids. And I've got a whole lot more work. I got a jillion papers of theirs that I've got to grade and get back to them and all that. And I've got to call parent, all those sorts of things. So I understand you want me to do more for John, but I'm kind of doing all I can do right now. And then planning. One of the things we know about collaboration, if teachers are going to work together, they've got to have time to plan together. How do you do that? How do you make that happen in a schedule? So those are some of the factors that we will be looking at. Other barriers may be conceptual. You know, the whole concept. Many teachers, especially teachers that have been around a while, you know, I've closed my doors and I've taught for years and years and years. That's, you know, this whole concept was that I became a teacher because I wanted to teach. I wanted to decide what was important for my kids. I wanted to teach that. And, you know, I just really don't want somebody else telling me what's important. Then the pragmatic, figuring out schedules, you know, figuring out a way to get the teachers time to work together, to collaborate like they need to in the planning process so that they can collaborate in the teaching process. And the whole attitudinal thing, you know, if I got an attitude that I know what I'm doing and you don't, or I know what I'm doing and I don't need your help, and you run into that sometime. You run into that, you know, I don't want to really pick on any age group, especially since I'm in the age group, but you get into those people with more gray hair that have been around a while, then they could have an attitude about this whole thing. The other barrier is, you know, professionalism. I would like to work with somebody, but you know, I've got to have the time to do it. I want to do it in a professional manner. Just let me do what I know how to do. So all that plays into it. The book then goes into talking about increasing student involvement as we're looking at school and family collaboration. One of the things they spend a lot of time on pages 66 and 67 is this whole idea of person-centered planning. You want to look at that child as a person, not just as a student and not just as, you know, another kid that, hey, he fits in this system. What we want to do is work on an individual plan for this particular child. Part of this whole person-centered planning, and I got to tell you, this is difficult for me as an old teacher. Professionals do not dictate the outcomes. I know what they're saying. The idea is that the parents, the family, are the ones that say, this is what we want out of their education. Remember when we talked about the people that are in this IEPT meeting or this ARD committee meeting? We said that the parent was the expert on the, anybody gonna help me?
The child.
Thank you. The parent's the expert on the child, and the teacher is the expert on the curriculum. The teacher knows what needs to be taught. Now, yeah, you're going to have some special ed kids that are who are so low that they're not really going to be on the everybody else. But for the most part, kids who are going to be included in general ed classes will be held accountable to some degree for their mastery of that content. Well, if the parents who are not professional educators don't understand that and they're the ones dictating the outcomes, you can see how that could become a problem. So I'm not saying this is a bad idea. I'm just saying it's rife with issues. Take a look at it and see table 3.1 there. Think about, yeah, that parent is the expert on that child, but there's a reason that we are professional educators. There's a reason that we have schools. There's a reason that we don't tell everybody, you go out there all by yourself and learn everything that you can, and then learn that to your kids. So we want to be careful about that. Another big trend these days is for student-led IEP team meetings, student-led art committee meetings. And, you know, I can see this happening when you get up with middle school and high school kiddos that really are, you know, especially once they're 18 years old, they are the adult. They're the one who is responsible. So if we have put things in place where we've taught that child self-advocacy skills, we've taught that child how these meetings run and who plays what role and all that kind of thing, I can see that we say, okay, you're going to be in charge of this meeting this time. Now we'll tell you what comes next, but then we want you to really advocate for yourself and tell us what we can do to help you. So I think that can be a good thing. We certainly want to work on our self-advocacy skills with our kiddos. But my big problem with all of this is the whole professional responsibility thing. You know, if I'm the administrator and I'm responsible for this building and everything that goes on in this school, I'm having a hard time turning over all that to a parent and a child. If I'm a teacher and I'm responsible for what this child learns, you know, say that this, I mean, I've had parents come in a meeting, a child that I was a student of, and said, we don't want him to go to school anymore. He gets in too much trouble when he goes to school, so we just want him to stay home. Well, we can't just do that. I mean, the parent has the right, if they want that bad enough, where they can pull him out of school. But as long as I'm the school, I can't say, oh yeah, that's great, take him home. He doesn't ever have to come back. You know, that doesn't work. So we do have to be aware of professional responsibility and what goes on in these types of things where you always be careful when you're delegating. You only delegate things that you feel good about being able to let go of. And I don't feel good about letting go of all of that. I do like some of this when in increasing family involvement, providing a climate of collaboration. I want to work with that parent. I cannot tell you how many times I've had parents come to me and, you know, they're really have had bad experiences in the past, and they come in there and they're just so antagonistic. They'll bring an advocate with them and all that. And I remember with one of those parents that we'd had about 4 of those very difficult meetings with. And finally, we were in the middle of one of these difficult meetings, and I was talking about their child, and the parent looked over at me and said, you really do care about my kid, don't you? I said, yes. Well, it was amazing. Just like all of that antagonism, all that anger that those parents had just went out of the room. So it was so much better once we both got on the page that we're all here trying to do what's best for the kids. I don't know where these schools are, or who these people are, who these educators are, who don't want what's best for kids, but so many parents you're going to run across have had bad experiences with schools, either themselves or as a parent, and it just really gets difficult for them to trust anybody at the school. Family-friendly language. One of the things we do in special education is we talk with a lot of abbreviations and acronyms and those sorts of things. You know, I went to the art today for Johnny, and, you know, he's LD as he can be. And on the WJ, he only scored a 95 for his IQ, but his reading was only about 73. And so that was a problem. But then we had a behavior issue, so we held an MDR, and in that they decided that he would probably need to go to ISS. And, you know, we talk, and all the parent has no clue what we're talking about. My daughter is now a special educator, and I remember the time that my wife and I were sitting at the table and we were having one of those conversations, and she, I think she was a sophomore in college at that point, and had come home, and she looked over at me and she's like, "I understand what y'all are talking about. I know your language now." And it was just a thrill for her to realize that this special ed language that we've been speaking, she now understood. But think about the family that doesn't understand what's going on. We also need to honor the family's time and their input. You know, back in the day, you could tell how important someone was by how long you had to wait to see them. You know, if you went to a doctor's office, it wasn't anything to wait an hour or two for the doctor to see you, those sorts of things. And I've been in schools that were that way, that they'll schedule a bunch of ARD meetings together, and then one starts going long and the next one starts going long. And before you know it, you've got some parent that's taken off work and they're there 2 or 3 hours waiting before their meeting ever starts. That's not honoring their time. You know, you wouldn't want that to happen to you. And so we don't want to do that to parents. We want to honor their input. Yes, I want their ideas. But then, you know, I kind of reserve the right to say, hey, I like that, and maybe there's a way we can work it in, but legally we need to do this. The best thing for the kid is to do this, but we're going to do that too. You know, those sorts of things. We can have those conversations, and we will honor their input without giving up our professional responsibility. We also need to provide information regarding the parental rights and responsibilities. That's actually a pretty easy thing to do. There's a booklet that all parents of kids in special ed get every time that you meet. And it explains all of their rights to them, parental rights and parental responsibilities. You know, it doesn't hurt to point out some of those things, but by the time they've been in special ed a while, or their kid has been in special ed a while, they're going to have a ton of those books. So that's an easy one. So let's get to co-teaching models and collaboration among school personnel. There are a number of different ways that this can be done. You can have one teacher who's teaching, they may be up in front of the class at the board, whatever, they're teaching a lesson, and another teacher's just kind of observing what's going on. You might have one teacher who's teaching, maybe up at the whiteboard or wherever, and the other teacher is drifting, going up and down the aisles, making sure that the kids are getting it, especially in a math or something like that, where you've got one up there teaching the concept and the kids are working it out on their paper. You got one drifting along, making sure that that those kids are really understanding, they're getting the problems down and done correctly. Station teaching. This may be a situation where we're working on, I don't know, let's say we're going to work on studying the manifest destiny, which is the social studies concept that the folks in the United States got the idea that it was their destiny to take this continent all the way from the Atlantic Ocean where they were to the Pacific Ocean. So Brianna and I might be co-teachers on this, and I'm going to talk about the East Coast and what's happening on the East Coast with a group of students over here. And then in 10 minutes or whatever, we're going to switch. And my group's going to go talk to Brianna, and she's going to teach them about what's happening on the West Coast with the Gold Rush and the Oregon Trail and all of that, where the people are moving to the West. So I'm talking East and she's talking West, and the kids move from one station to the other. Parallel teaching. This can get kind of tricky. It's basically both teachers are teaching the same thing. And in a lot of ways and a lot of reasons you might want to do this, but it may be that we're both teaching the same concept to everyone, because I may say it differently than you, and the way I say it, some kids might get, and the way you say it, other kids might get. Another way you could do parallel teaching is that you're teaching to the big class, and I'm sitting over here with a smaller group of students, kids that normally have a tough time getting it, and you're teaching the big concept to them. I'm teaching the same thing to them, but I'm simplifying it a little bit. Alternative teaching is you're teaching the lesson. I've got this kid over here that there is no way he's going to understand anything that you're talking about. You may be talking about, biology, and you're talking about reptiles, and I'm over here helping this child. We got a picture of a turtle, and we're labeling, the head, the tail, the shell, and these different things. So alternative teaching, I'm teaching part of it, still in the same concept that you're teaching, but more on this child's level. And the last one there is team teaching. And that's where we kind of team up. I'll do a part, you'll do a part. I did a team teaching one year with a teacher friend of mine, where we combined history and English. And we had a really fun time with that, where whatever period of history we were talking about, I would bring in literature from that time period. So you can do those sorts of things. Of course, a lot of things have to work out. But you see Terry and Terry up there. I'll tell you about the best teaching team, the team teaching team that I've ever seen. And that was with two people who happen to both be named Terry. Now, the first Terry was a math teacher, and he was a old middle-aged man who was a math teacher, and he was pretty strict, and he knew his stuff, but he didn't take much guff. But he happened to be on a teaching team that got the kids that had special education needs were placed on that team. It was the green team. Don't know how they came up with that color, but that was the green team. And then there was a lady named Terry. Now, the lady named Terry was a special ed teacher. She was pretty old by this point. She was short, and she was pretty big around, and she was pretty tough. And she just determined, when they said, okay, we want y'all to team teach these kids, Mr. Terry really didn't want to have anything to do with it. He was pretty adamant that he could teach by himself, and that if special ed kids had a problem, then he would get them some help somehow. But other Terry, special ed Terry, determined that she was going to be a part of this thing, and she was going to make it work. So every time that they had a planning period, Terry would, and Terry happened to be the special education department chair, so she could schedule the special ed teachers how they needed to be. So she always scheduled herself to have planning period at the same time that Terry had a planning period, and she basically just forced herself on him. And eventually he came to see that, hey, this works. They used that one teach, one drift model by and large for everything, because he really liked to stand up at the whiteboard and teach his concepts, and he was pretty good at doing that. And she was constantly up and down the aisles working with these kiddos. The neat thing about it was, she didn't just work with the special ed kids. If you didn't know who was who, you'd walk in that room and you'd see these two teachers working together, and you would think, wow, there's two teachers in here. You wouldn't realize that one of them was a special education teacher, because she would help all students. That way the special ed kids didn't feel that they were being singled out in any way. They weren't embarrassed because she could be helping anybody at any given time. They ended up making a great team, and they worked together that way for several years until Terry finally retired. Special ed Terry, other Terry's still teaching. But what I learned from that is personality is huge. If you're going to do this, you may have to overcome a lot of adversity. You may have to overcome a lot of folks who really don't want you doing what you're doing to make it work. But she did, and it worked very well. The next part on collaborating among school personnel is with administrators, paraprofessionals, and related service personnel. Sometimes we need help from our administrators. That's just how it is. And if you have an administrator who works well with you and works hard for you and will help you out, then that's great. But we also have to understand administrators are very busy. I know when I was a teacher before I became an administrator, I really thought I could tell that principal how he could do a much better job. But all I saw was my perspective from my classroom. Later on, when I became an administrator, I realized, oh man, this picture is so much bigger than I saw from room 228 that it's a whole different ballgame. So yes, they can be a huge help to us. They can help us get resources. They can help us get materials. They can do all of that. But at the end of the day, I'm the teacher. They're the administrator. I feel the same way when it comes to behavior. I never wanted a teacher to rely on me as an administrator to make her class behave. You know, she needed to be able to do that. Now, certainly if you had a kid who was a problem, then yeah, I need to get rid of that kid for you. I need to get them out of, not get rid of them, but get rid of them temporarily, pull them out of there while they're disturbing the class, try to get them back on track. But I don't want to, if I'm the teacher, I don't want to give up my power by saying, hey class, I can't control you. I've got to call somebody else in here to do that. Paraprofessionals, unsung heroes of schools. They are the ones who do so much of the work, get paid very little for what they do. Some paraprofessionals are, trained as teachers. Others of them have, they have their GED, but hey, they're working on it. So there are a lot of different levels and a lot of different abilities of the paraprofessionals. Actually, my first year in teaching, I worked as a paraprofessional, and I, had a degree already, but that was the job that was available. So you can have professionals who go on to have great careers as educators beyond being a paraprofessional, just as a teacher or becoming an administrator or whatever else. You need to find the strengths. Anybody that you're working with, just like with your students, you find the strengths of your students. You find the strengths of your paraprofessionals, the folks that you're working with. And the next group there is related service personnel. Our related service personnel are people who who have a special job that they do. They may come in and do speech therapy. They may come in and do mobility and orientation training for our people who have visual issues. This is the person that teaches the blind person, or the person with blindness, person with visual issues, how to use the white cane, mobility specialist. You have people like a behavior interventionist. So I've included there a picture of behavior interventionist. Actually, that's a really sick joke. I got a student one time. I went to an ARD meeting across town at a school, and they had a kid that they were sending to my class. They were going to send him from his home school to my class because of his behavior. And this was a kid that had Tourette's syndrome and had a history of getting in fights and being in all kinds of problems and all that kind of thing. And the diagnostician that day told me, said, oh, you're just going to love Adam. He's just a wonderful kid. You'll just love Adam. He's just such a great kid. and I had known this diagnostician quite a long time by that point, and I finally said to her, just cut the crap. You know, if this was a really good kid that everybody liked, he wouldn't be coming to my class. Let's just be honest about it. And she kind of looked at me taken aback, and then she said, well, I guess you're right. But in this meeting, I said, you know, I don't know the first thing about Tourette's syndrome. And the mom said, oh, it's okay. It's okay. I have a video here. It's a video of a Jerry Springer show. You watch that and it'll tell you everything you need to know. Like, great. And then this other lady spoke up and she said, well, I'm actually a behavior interventionist. And I said, oh, good. I need to talk to you because I won't know what's a tick and what's a intentional behavior and all that. Don't you worry. I'll be in your class all the time. Well, this is a picture of her in my class because she never came. I never saw her again after that one meeting. Sometime you end up where the related service personnel that you need or the people that you really need to collaborate with aren't there. So that brings us on back, looking at a couple more things, and then we're going to get back to John here. Early childhood intervention. So we talked about how some kids are identified at birth or soon after birth, and they start receiving early childhood intervention services. Well, the team that's been providing those services can collaborate with your team at the elementary school to transition that child from the early childhood intervention into the class when they get old enough to do that. On the other end, you have the adult transition services. You have kiddos that are still going to have needs after they've graduated, maybe job skills and those sorts of things. Well, those are adult transition services where these kiddos that even after they're 18 years old can stay in the system up until they're 22 and they can continue to receive services. Again, you're going to need collaboration. You're going to need people working within the community as job coaches and things like that, but they're also working with the school. So let's get back to John. We've had some time to think about it, had some time to look at it. We've thought about all these different collaboration things that need to happen. I think I pointed out that the school psychologist was involved. Well, most of our cases will not include a school psychologist. There are some districts in Texas who use school psychologists exclusively, but most schools in Texas use educational diagnosticians and will just have very few school psychologists. So the educational diagnostician is probably the one that's going to be in the ARD meeting, probably the one running the ARD meeting oftentimes. So realistically, let's just talk for a minute. What do you think about John? You want John in your class? What issues do you see?
Well, I feel if he doesn't have the behavioral issues that they say that he doesn't, I guess I wouldn't see a problem with him being in any sort of classroom if he doesn't technically have the behavioral issues of a child with special needs. So I'm not sure it would be a problem.
That certainly makes it much easier. Yeah. Other thoughts?
I feel like it probably wouldn't be in his best interest to be in a general education classroom, but if he does have the professional along with him, I guess it could help a bit.
I didn't understand that first part. You thought he would or would not do well in the general ed class?
It might not be in his best interest to be there since his IQ is so low, and if you're just a general ed teacher, you most likely don't have special education, training, in quotes.
Yeah.
So I guess it probably wouldn't be in his best interest, but I guess since he has the, what's his name? The other teacher?
Oh, Mr. Doss, yeah.
Yeah, I guess since he has Mr. Doss I'm assuming that helps him.
Yeah, I would hope so. It's interesting you bring up that about training. There are many general ed teachers out there who have special ed kids included in their classes, and this class that we're in right now is the only special ed training they've ever had.
I feel like if you want to be a teacher, I feel like you should have at least a little bit of training other than just like one class. I feel like you should have a little bit more education because obviously you're going to have a student in your class, and I feel like it would be helpful to you as well as everybody else to know how to help that student in that type of situation, especially if you're I guess trying not diagnose, but like if you're trying to see if they need to transition into the other classroom, I guess it would be helpful to have the information yourself.
Yeah. It's good. Anybody else want to join in here? You want John in your class? All right. Well, I'm enjoying how the semester started off. I hope that everybody's getting something out of it, and we'll just carry on. Y'all let me know if you need me. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank y'all. Hope you had a good weekend.
You too.